Today, let's explore a huge idea. What if thinking is the greatest form of worship?
That's a pretty bold claim, right? It means our actions are only as good as our thoughts.
So what is real thinking? Well, first, let's talk about what it's not.
It's not just the stuff that pops into your head. That's more like mental chatter, not real thinking.
No, real thinking is way more structured. It's deliberate, it takes focus, it's a skill you build.
This four-step process is the key. It moves us from just reacting to actively engaging with the world.
And this whole journey, it's how we build an authentic self. Let's look at identity versus selfhood. Okay, so identity is the label society gives you. They help us belong, but they can also box us in. But selfhood, that's something you have to build yourself. It's this ongoing, lifelong process. So does that mean we're just trapped in those identities? Absolutely not. The key to breaking free is thinking. This is how you do it. You actively think about those labels, and then you decide what fits. You know, a huge part of this is our relationship with tradition. It can be a big help or a major hurdle. So you've got two paths, blindly imitating the past, or really engaging in authentic inquiry. This makes active thinking a huge responsibility. It's like a sacred trust that we have to take care of. Because in the end, that's the whole point. All this thinking is what builds a strong, authentic character. So, where do you start? The journey to an authentic you begins with just one conscious thought.
So what does it actually mean to think? I mean, really think. We're about to break down a pretty incredible lecture that completely reframes this fundamental human activity, not just as a skill, but as the absolute key to building a free and authentic life. Let's just dive right in.
Think about it for a second. Animals can solve problems, sure. And computers? They process data at speeds we can't even imagine. So what is it about your mind, about human thought, that really sets it apart from everything else? What's our unique ingredient?
Well, the answer is just one single powerful concept: responsibility. And look, this isn't just about being accountable for our actions. It goes so much deeper than that. It's about the very nature of thought itself. The ability to think isn't just a skill we have, it's a profound duty that's been entrusted to us. Okay, so here's our first big idea. Thinking isn't just something we do. It's a massive responsibility we carry. It's really at the core of what it means to be human.
You see, an animal's thinking is all about survival, right? It's driven by instinct. But for humans, it's a completely different ballgame. Our thinking is tied to this idea of responsibility. We're not just trying to stay alive. We're fundamentally accountable for how we use our minds.
There's this beautiful Turkish word for this, emanet. It means more than just trust. It's like a sacred responsibility that's given to you because you're seen as worthy and capable of protecting it. The lecture makes this amazing point that our ability to think is an emanet. It's this precious gift we have to cherish, not just let it run on autopilot.
So if thinking is our great responsibility, what does it actually, look like to do it properly? Let's start by getting really clear on what thinking isn't.
First off, thinking isn't just that random chatter that goes on in our heads. And it's definitely not a knee-jerk emotional reaction. It's also not simply repeating what you've memorized or what someone else told you. That's just imitation. No, true thinking is the exact opposite of all that. It's deliberate, it's active, and it's structured. So what does that structured process actually involve? Well, it starts with a conscious choice to really focus on something. Then, and this is key, you set up clear criteria for how you're going to judge it. From there, it's a gradual, step-by-step process, making sure all the pieces fit together logically. And finally, you have to back up your conclusions with actual evidence, not just feelings. It's a rigorous, demanding activity for sure.
Okay, this next part is maybe the most profound idea in the entire lecture. It's the idea that this kind of rigorous, responsible thinking is in fact the highest form of worship.
Now, I know that might sound a little provocative, but the logic behind it is just so powerful. The speaker argues that without a solid foundation of deep, critical thought, all the other rituals or acts of faith, they lose their meaning, their quality. An action you perform without understanding why you're doing it is really just an empty gesture. Thinking is what gives real substance to belief.
And the story of Abraham is held up as the perfect example of this. We often think of it as a story of blind faith, but it's really a masterclass in inquiry. He observes the world around him. He asks questions. He establishes a rational criterion that a true God can't just disappear.
And it's through this logical process that he comes to his conclusion. His faith is built, not just inherited. It's the product of authentic thought. So this is all great, but how do we take this powerful tool and actually apply it to our own lives? Well, this is where it gets super personal. We're talking about using thinking to literally construct the very essence of who we are. We all start with something the source calls Kimlik. Think of these as the external identities, the labels we're given, all the pre-made boxes that society has waiting for us from the day we're born. You know the labels: mother, doctor, immigrant, believer, man, woman. These are all forms of Kimlik. And they're not all bad. They can give us a sense of belonging, which is comforting. But they're also reductions, right? They don't capture the full, complex, messy truth of who any of us really are. So this begs a really important question. If we're all born into these identities and we're surrounded by them our whole lives, are we just stuck? Are we fated to live inside these little boxes that society hands us? The answer is a resounding no. And the way out is through something called kindlik, or selfhood. And here's the crucial difference. Identity is something you find yourself in. Selfhood is something you consciously build. It's not a destination you arrive at. It's a lifelong, dynamic process of becoming. So how do we build it? Well, thinking is the ultimate tool. We encounter all these external identities, the Kimlik, but instead of just passively accepting them, we apply critical thought. We analyze them, we question them, and then we consciously choose what to keep, what to reject, and maybe what to transform into something new. It's from that process that we forge our own authentic self. So what are the guiding principles for this kind of free-thinking mind, especially when we're dealing with tradition and the past? Let's break down some practical steps. The first principle is all about how we relate to the past. We have to avoid sanctifying it, treating it like this sacred, unchangeable thing that we can never question. Instead, we should see it as a foundation, a source of memory and experience that we can use to build a visionary future. The past should be a resource, not a cage. And that means we have to move away from what you could call manufactured authority, where we just uncritically accept judgments from the past. We need to move towards creative freedom. We have the right, and really the responsibility, to engage with today's problems on our own terms, using our own minds. Next up, we have to stop treating past interpretations as if they're absolute truths. Instead of being stuck with one person's subjective view from a specific time in history, our thinking should be aiming for a principled objectivity, seeking out universal principles that can actually be tested and applied by anyone, anywhere. This brings us right back to one of the core themes. The source calls imitation, or taqlit, a leash on the mind and even a deadly poison. It's the enemy of authentic thought. The antidote is tahqiq, which is authentic inquiry, that relentless drive to understand why, not just blindly accept what. And finally, we have to choose productive dynamism over stagnation. I mean, think about it. Nothing in this universe is just handed to us in a complete finished package. Creation itself is an ongoing process of becoming, so it makes sense that our thinking has to be dynamic too, constantly growing and adapting, not static and frozen in time. So let's just wrap this all up. We've seen that thinking is a sacred trust, a tough, rigorous process, and the main tool we have for building an authentic self. The lecture leaves us with one essential challenge, one big question. If your ability to think truly is your greatest responsibility, how will you choose to use it?
Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to tackle something so basic, so fundamental, that we almost never actually stop to think about it. And that is thinking itself. We're going to completely change how you see what it really means to think.
So let's just start with that big question, right? What is thinking? No, seriously, I want you to take a second. When you say, hang on, I'm thinking, what's actually going on up there?
For a lot of us, it might be a worry just popping into your head. Or maybe it's that aha moment, a sudden idea. Could just be daydreaming, imagining stuff. Or hey, maybe you go old school philosophy, right? I think, therefore I am. And look, those are all totally normal answers, but they barely scratch the surface of what we're talking about today.
Because what we're digging into here is the idea that true thinking, well, it's something way, way deeper. It's not just the random static in our brains. It's a conscious, deliberate process. And get this, it's framed as one of the most profound responsibilities we have as people, a responsibility.
All right, so let's break this down. What is this true thinking really all about? And maybe more importantly, what isn't it?
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Look at this contrast. On one side, you've got what our brains just do. Mental autopilot, spontaneous thoughts, those knee-jerk emotional reactions, just spitting back something we memorized or blindly copying what everyone else does. There's a great term for this, taklit. But then look at the other side. True thinking. That's work. It's deliberate. It's based on actual criteria. It's a process, and it demands evidence. It's really the difference between being a passenger in your own head versus grabbing the steering wheel. And why does this matter? Well, staying on autopilot leaves you wide open to bad ideas, and honestly, it just stops you from ever really growing.
And this leads to a really powerful concept. The idea is that our ability to think isn't just some biological quirk. It's an imenet, which is a beautiful word that means a sacred trust. Think about that. A trust. It's something given to us that we have a duty to take care of, to use well, and to not just let it, go to waste. You wouldn't be careless with something precious someone entrusted to you, right? Well, the same exact thing applies to your mind.
Okay, so if thinking is this big act of responsibility, how in the world do we actually do it? Like, what are the steps? Well, lucky for us, there's a pretty clear, practical blueprint for putting this whole thing into action.
It all boils down to 3 simple but honestly game-changing steps. First, you just have to notice. Really see the world around you, like you're looking at it for the very first time, breaking out of that daily haze. Then, from noticing comes wonder. You have to let yourself ask those simple, almost childlike questions. What is that? Why is it that way? How does that work? That curiosity, that's the fuel. It's what pushes you to the final step, to engage, to go out and actively hunt for answers and start connecting the dots.
I know this might sound a little abstract, but there's actually a perfect story that shows this whole blueprint in action, and it's the classic story of the prophet Abraham's journey of discovery. So just think about it for a second. Everyone back then saw the same sun, the same moon, the same stars. It was just the sky. But Abraham, he didn't just see them, he noticed them. He looked up, and it was like he was seeing them for the very first time, not just taking them for granted as part of the background.
And that simple act of noticing, well, it sparked the next step, wonder. He started asking these huge fundamental questions. What are these things, really? What do they have to do with whatever created them? He wasn't content with the easy, accepted answers.
And this part is so crucial. He didn't just get lost in wonder. He set up a rule, a logical test for his ideas. His criterion was simple. Things that set cannot be my Lord. He watched the stars, the moon, the sun, and he realized that anything that disappears, that isn't permanent, couldn't be the ultimate power he was searching for.
So through that very clear process, noticing, questioning, and then testing, he reached a conclusion that literally changed everything. And it wasn't just some abstract thought. It completely reshaped his reality and became the foundation for everything he did from that moment on.
And that story is such a perfect example of how this isn't just about figuring out the universe. This same process is the #1 tool we have for our most important project, building our own self, our own character. So the framework here presents this really cool 3-stage journey. We all start with what's called identity, or kimlik. These are the labels we're just given, son, daughter, your job title, your nationality. Then there's personality, or kishillik, which is basically how other people judge you in those roles. Are you a good student, a successful employee? But the goal, the final stage is selfhood, or kendidik. And that's the person you build through your own thought.
So, how do you actually build that selfhood? Well, it's not about throwing away all your identities. It's about taking them and actively thinking about them. You have to really understand them, figure out what they mean to you, and then make a choice. What parts fit? What parts do you need to let go of? What can you transform into something that is truly, authentically your own?
Now, obviously, this whole process is not easy. And maybe one of the biggest hurdles we all face is our relationship with tradition. Because tradition can be an incredible source of wisdom, or it can be a mental cage that stops us from thinking for ourselves.
And this chart just lays out the choice perfectly. You've got the stagnant mindset, which treats the past as sacred and basically just demands taklit, that blind imitation we talked about. This is like going into the family business just because that's what you're supposed to do, without ever asking if you even like it. Then you have the dynamic mindset. This is all about tahqiq, authentic, deep inquiry. It's where you respect the past for sure, but you also use your own mind to build a future that's right for you. It's really the difference between being a museum curator, just preserving what's already there, and being an architect, using the best materials from the past to create something totally new.
Okay, so this all leads us to what might be the most powerful, maybe even controversial idea we're going to talk about today. And that is the ultimate purpose, the highest calling of our minds.
And the why behind it is actually pretty simple and elegant. Why is thinking the ultimate purpose? Well, because without it, without that conscious, deliberate thought, everything else we do, all our actions, our beliefs, they're kind of hollow. An action without real thought behind it is just going through the motions. And a belief you've never really thought about is fragile. It can be knocked over by the slightest push.
And that brings us to the core message, the ultimate takeaway here. And it's this quote: "Thinking is the greatest act of worship." From this perspective, the best, most profound way to honor the gift of consciousness, that amanat, that trust we were given, is simply to use it, to think deeply, to think clearly, and to think for yourself.
So, we'll leave you with a question to chew on. This whole thing, it isn't just a mental exercise, right? It's a tool for real transformation. So think about it. What's one identity, one label, one role you carry around every single day that you've just kind of accepted without really thinking about it? And what do you think might happen if you really truly started to...
Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is to take complicated source material, peel back the layers, and give you the nuggets of insight that will genuinely make you better informed.
Today, we are really getting into something fundamental.
We really are. We're doing a deep dive into an activity we all think we do every day, but, well, maybe we don't understand it at all. We're talking about the rigorous architecture of authentic thought.
And this is a powerful source. We're synthesizing insights from a lecture by Tuzba Gunal. And it doesn't treat thinking as, some abstract mental pastime. It defines it as a very specific, criteria-based activity that carries enormous weight.
It makes a huge claim right from the start, doesn't it?
A revolutionary one. It posits that effective, purposeful thinking, when it's done rigorously, is the biggest and most important act of worship, or ibadah.
Wow. Okay, so that immediately raises the stakes. If thinking is that important, we have to define it properly.
We have to.
So our mission for you, the listener, is to understand this incredibly high bar that's being set for genuine thought, and then to see how this internal intellectual rigor directly constructs your personal responsibility, your identity, and, well, your very character, your authentic self.
And to do that, you need a framework. This isn't just about general reasoning. We'll be synthesizing some really specific concepts, different cognitive processes like takul, which is like understanding, tisakur, or remembering, and tedabur, which is planning. This whole exploration demands structure and a lot of deep personal engagement.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right at the core question. If thinking is this immense act of worship, who is this responsibility for? Is it for everyone?
The source makes a really clear distinction right away. When we talk about conscious, multidimensional, purposeful, and truly competent, the word used is yetkin thought, we are talking specifically about the human being.
Okay, so that distinction is the foundation for everything else.
It is. It's the bedrock of the whole argument.
But why draw the line there? I mean, we all know animals think, right? A crow uses tools. A dog can solve problems. Isn't that a form of thought?
It is, and the source acknowledges that. It says animals do engage in a level of cognitive activity, which it calls idrak. That's perception or comprehension. So they definitely have intelligence that's relevant to their world.
But it's missing something.
It's missing the human dimension. The specific dimension that makes our thought subject to ultimate, profound ethical responsibility.
And what is that critical difference? What elevates our thought beyond just instinct or, clever pattern recognition?
It's the tight, inseparable connection between our ability to think and the concept of responsibility. Mm-hmm. The source establishes that our capacity for this rigorous, purposeful thought is the very foundation for being held accountable, for being obligated. The term is mukallaf kalina bil mesi.
Mukallaf kalina bil mesi. I've heard that. It means, what, being made subject to a duty?
Exactly. So the very fact that we can think in this sophisticated way is the thing that makes us morally on the hook for our choices.
So it's not just a cool biological advantage we have. It's a burden.
It's a burden. Thinking is both your personal responsibility, something you have to do to be fully human, and it's the basis for your accountability to, well, a higher order. This is the pin that connects the intellectual to the moral.
And that leads us straight into this idea of thought as a profound trust, or amana.
Yes.
I find that concept so powerful. It reframes our mind not as something we own, but as something we've been given on loan.
That's a great way to put it. Because if this faculty of thought is a trust and a mana, given only to a being who is reliable and capable of carrying that immense weight.
The weight of responsibility.
Right. Then there are immediate and, frankly, severe implications for how we use it. This trust must not be abused. It can't be neglected or wasted. It has to be protected, and its requirements have to be fulfilled.
So if you're given this unique, high-fidelity instrument for telling truth from falsehood, you have a deep moral duty to keep it sharp and use it for what it was made for.
Exactly. To let it rust, or to, use it to hammer in a nail, is a betrayal of the trust itself. The individual is held to account not just for what they do, but for the quality of the intellectual process that led to that action.
So what is the intended purpose then? What's the ultimate goal of this trust?
The goal isn't just quiet contemplation. It's about application. It's transformation. A thinking person is expected to use this trust to find what is right, what is good, what is beautiful, and then, crucially, to strive to implement those values in their actions.
So theory and practice become inseparable.
They have to be.
If I spend 10 years thinking about economic justice, but I never do anything to apply those ideas, or worse, I act against them, I failed the mana of thought.
The source would argue you failed both yourself and your responsibility. The thinking process has to enrich both the mind and the action that comes from it. The quality of your thought dictates the quality of your action, and in a way, vice versa. It's a loop.
And if the results of our thinking, our beliefs, our actions are inconsistent or they contradict each other, that's a signal that we failed way back in the reflection stage.
Exactly. The source asks, how do we know if our thinking is successful? It's when the results are consistent and whole, when they complete and complement each other without contradiction. That consistency is what the divine trusts. A thoughtful person is one who uses this potential to make sure their foundation is sound.
And that's why it's the most important act of worship.
Right, because all the external acts, all the rituals, they lack substance if the intellectual foundation is rotten or flimsy or just, based on a mistake.
Okay, that sets an enormous expectation. But before we get into the architecture of what genuine thought is, we have to clear the decks. We need to separate this incredibly rigorous process from all the other mental noise that we often mistake for thinking.
This is such a crucial step. If we don't define the boundaries, we risk thinking we're doing profound intellectual labor when we're actually just, distracted or repeating something.
So the source gives us 4 categories of mental activity that happen in our minds but are absolutely not genuine thought.
That's right.
Let's start with the most common one, the mental background noise.
First, random, fleeting thoughts. These are the disconnected moments that just pop into your mind. They don't have a coherent pattern or orun-ruzus. They're short-lived, out of context. The source calls them fragmented things, parsa Schuyler. They're missing that sustained, conscious intent.
Right. So if I'm in a meeting and my mind jumps from the quarterly report to wondering if I need to buy milk to remembering a weird dream I had, that's not thinking. That's just mental clutter.
It's just neurological residue. There might be raw data in there, but it hasn't been put through the grinder of selection and concentration.
Okay. The second category seems to be about speed and emotion.
It is. Second, sudden emotional reflexes. These are those instantaneous, high-speed reactions to things. A sudden burst of anger, a flash of excitement, getting defensive, making a snap judgment under pressure.
So the difference between pausing to really analyze a colleague's critique
and just immediately lashing out because you feel attacked.
Right.
Exactly. These are reactions that happen before that intentional cognitive architecture can even be built. The source is explicit. Reflex is not thought. Genuine thought requires a pause. It requires measurement, applying criteria, and reflexes just bypass all of that.
Okay, the third one. This one hits close to home for anyone who's ever, crammed for an exam. The idea that knowing a lot of stuff is the same as being a good thinker.
Right. Third, repeating memorized information. The source stresses that the mind's job is not to be a warehouse. It's not a depot. Its task is not just to store information and then retrieve it when you need it. That is just memorization.
So if I can perfectly recite the 3 main causes of World War I, but I have no idea how to apply those lessons to a conflict happening today.
You haven't truly thought about it. You are, in a sense, just reciting. Genuine thought demands synthesis of that information, comparing it, making new connections, challenging the narrative, and ultimately creating something new, a new application, a better justification, a deeper understanding.
If you don't create the connection yourself, you're just a sophisticated playback device.
That's it. And that's a huge distinction for you, the listener, because society often rewards the ability to recall facts much more than the ability to synthesize them.
Yeah, it shifts the focus from input to output.
And that leads us to the fourth category. You mentioned it earlier. It's maybe the most detrimental to our amana.
This is the big one.
Fourth, accepting external judgments without critique. This is treating the ideas or worldviews of others, whether it's a politician, a famous academic, a religious figure, as an absolute authority, without doing your own rigorous analysis, without demanding the justification, the why.
And this has a specific, very negative name.
Yes.
Yeah.
This specific act is called imitation or taklit. The source positions taklit as the absolute antithesis of thought. It's the opposite.
Wow.
If you adopt a worldview or a dogma, just because a person or an institution has authority, you've outsourced your cognitive responsibility.
Yeah.
You stop thinking. You're just replicating someone else's conclusion without building your own justified foundation for it.
We have to linger on taklit for a second. If it's the antithesis of thought, that means avoiding it is the first act of real intellectual freedom.
Absolutely. The source suggests that when someone embraces taklit, they are forfeiting the very potential that makes them human and responsible. You're taking a shortcut to a conclusion, sure, but in doing that, you're short-circuiting your ability to live an authentic, justified life. You might get social comfort, but you sacrifice intellectual integrity.
So we've cleared the ground. No fleeting thoughts, no emotional reflexes, no simple memorization, and definitely no blind imitation. Now we can define the positive process.
Okay, now we can lay out the rigorous multi-step structure required for thought to actually qualify as genuine, coherent, and useful. I mean, if we accept the premise that this is the highest form of worship, it has to be demanding, it has to have rigor, and this is the blueprint.
You mentioned there are 6 necessary parameters. Let's walk through them maybe with some examples.
Okay, first, intentional and conscious selection. The Arabic is kasıtlı bilinçli. Thought has to be deliberate. You must actively choose a subject and set it as the focus of your intellectual activity. It's the total opposite of those random thoughts we just dismissed.
So this is me saying, okay, for the next hour, my only goal is to think about the long-term impact of AI on labor markets. It's an act of mental discipline.
Exactly. And that flows directly into the second. Serious concentration. Serial yosunlaşma. Once you've selected your topic, a superficial glance isn't enough. There has to be focused, intense engagement with it. You have to resist distraction and bring your maximum brain power to it.
Okay, intent and focus, that makes sense. But the third one, I think, is where the real rigor starts to kick in. Establishing criteria. Ulsut belirlim.
This is so vital to make sure the knowledge you produce is sound, that it's verifiable, and that it's not just arbitrary. The term is gelişi güzel. You have to define the standards of truth and validity you're working toward. You have to know what a successful, rational conclusion looks like before you even start looking at the data.
Okay, so if I'm trying to figure out an ethical framework for a tough decision, my criteria might be something like, any solution has to be universally applicable, it has to be transparent, and it must promote the greatest long-term good.
Yes. That criterion then limits the kinds of conclusions you're allowed to accept. That structure is the foundation. If you don't establish the measure, any random conclusion can feel right, and that violates the whole demand for accountability.
Okay, fourth, stepwise progression or aşamalık. This suggests thought isn't just a flash of insight.
No, it's not instantaneous. It requires stage-by-stage exploration, moving Tetrising gradually. This means breaking down the topic into subtopics, understanding how they fit together, making sure there's internal consistency, and really resisting that urge to just jump to the conclusion. A genuine thinker explores the issue methodically. Step A has to lead logically to step B, and so on.
The journey has to be justifiable, not just the destination.
And that leads to fifth, consistency and evidence. Tutarluluk ve delindirme. The judgments you arrive at have to be coherent. They can't contradict what you've already established as true, and this is key. They have to be supported by convincing arguments or argumentaler. You have to be able to show, with reason and evidence, why your conclusion is rational and not just arbitrary, not kifeliktenuzak.
You have to show your work.
You have to show your work. And finally, sixth, alignment with core principles. This is like the final quality control check.
The ultimate filter.
It is. Your conclusion, no matter how well argued, has to be tested against 3 established principles. Is it rational? Akli. Is it ethical? Akdaiki. And does it align with your fundamental doctrinal beliefs? Kaitakati. If your rigorously evidenced conclusion violates any of these foundational filters, the thought process has to be revised, because true thought can't lead to an irrational or an unethical outcome.
This whole process is, it's so incredibly demanding. It makes me wonder, if this is the prerequisite for fulfilling the amana, doesn't that mean most of our day-to-day thinking falls short? Is the source saying only, philosophers are capable of this?
That's a critical question. And the source addresses it by stressing that these 6 parameters are not about the speed or the volume of your thinking. They're about the quality.
Okay.
Every human being has the innate potential, the fitrat, to apply these parameters, even if the subject is simple. It's not just for academics. It's for anyone who's seeking truth and wants their actions to be justified and meaningful.
So what kicks this whole demanding process off? What's the spark?
It begins with 2 really simple acts: perception, or fark edmek, followed by curiosity, merik edmek. You notice something isn't as you expected it to be, and then you get curious about it.
And that curiosity leads directly to the big questions.
Yes. What is this? Why is it like this? For what reason, Neeson, should it be this way? How does it work? When does this happen? This active questioning is the engine of thought. And the ultimate benefit is that it prevents you from falling into that passive state, that state of apathy, routine, being closed off to development, which the source calls the sleep state, or ukuhali.
Right.
True thought moves you from being a passive receiver of information to being an active, dynamic agent in the world.
And we have a perfect historical example of this whole 6-step process in action, the story of the prophet Abraham. It really shows what it means to apply this kind of rigor to existence itself.
It's the primary example the source material gives. You see Abraham observing the celestial bodies, the moon, the stars, the sun. He wasn't just seeing them. He was applying perception, farketmek, with what the source calls a new eye. He wasn't just accepting the common belief about them.
He was looking at existence as a problem to be solved.
He was. And he immediately showed intention and concentration by seriously and relentlessly searching for the divine reality. And then, this is the key move, he established his intellectual criteria, his measurement, instantly.
Batan Lauden Rob Olmaz.
A sinking or setting entity cannot be the Lord. Anything that is transient, anything that comes and goes, cannot be the ultimate supreme reality.
That one single criterion is a massive philosophical leap. It sets a non-negotiable standard for divinity based on permanence and self-sufficiency.
And because he set that criterion, he could then begin the progression. He moved stage by stage through the moon, then the stars, then the sun, and showed that each one failed his criterion. This step-by-step determination led him to his ultimate result and action.
He arrived at the conclusion of a singular supreme creator by rational inferences to volley, and then critically he acted on it.
Yes, he didn't just keep this profound conclusion in his head. He confronted the prevailing beliefs and customs of his entire society. He moved beyond mere seeing German and usini gesti to see the deep implication of what he was witnessing.
He developed a second consciousness. His thinking wasn't abstract, it was transformative. It changed his entire relationship with existence and the world around him.
And that example proves that these 6 criteria aren't just a theoretical wish list. They are applicable in practice, and they lead to revolutionary change when you apply them sincerely.
The complexity of that process with Abraham, it brings up another point. The source uses so many different words for this kind of thinking. Tako, teseka, tefikur, tedebur. Why all the different verbs?
This is a really important point in the source material. It argues that this variety of verbs is highly significant. If there were just one word for thinking, the text would use it consistently. The fact that it uses multiple verbs indicates that the mind is complex and multi-layered, and that these are different specialized dimensions of the same core activity.
Okay, let's try to categorize these to make them easier for the listener to grasp. Maybe if we organize them by their focus in time past, present, or future?
That's a very effective way to simplify them. The main one, takul, is just general rational understanding. It's the overall capacity. But the others refine that.
Okay.
So if we start with the past, you have techecker. This is specifically about memory and past experience. It means remembering the past, taking lessons from it, extracting wisdom, and using those past experiences to inform what you're doing right now. It binds you to your own history so you don't keep making the same mistakes.
So techecker is like historical self-awareness.
Exactly. Then you have the concepts that are focused on the present, on deeper contemplation. Tekkakur implies deep, systematic contemplation, often on the natural world or complex ideas, trying to grasp their essence. And timiel is similar. It often means patient, slow consideration, just mulling over a problem until a solution emerges.
So those are about processing and absorbing the now.
Yes. And then tefaku comes in. This is often used to mean deep comprehension or specialized understanding, like becoming an expert in a field through intense intellectual effort.
And finally, the future-oriented one.
That's tedabir. This means future planning, taking precautions, developing strategies. The word for that is tedbir. So how do you plan effectively? You look at your past, tetsakur, and your present, and you use that deep analysis, tefakur, to project and safeguard the future. All these distinct cognitive acts have to be engaged at the same time for our human potential, our feitrat, to fully unfold and fulfill that amana.
So if you're only engaging in one type of thought, say you're only memorizing the past, only doing tzeker, you're neglecting the need to plan for the future, the tetebur, and so you're failing the holistic job of the mind.
Precisely. The mind has to operate in all dimensions, past, present, and future, to produce results that are consistent, whole, and transformative.
Okay, we've established the rigor of the process. Now for the payoff. If thought is this rigorous, dynamic process, a move from passive acceptance to active, multidimensional engagement, what does that intellectual labor produce in us, in our lives?
This is where the internal rigor meets the external reality of our social existence. The source argues that this kind of thinking is what gives a person personality or character, what it calls shakhsiyat.
Okay.
See, humans are driven to understand our place in the world. And this existential search leads to 3 stages, or 3 ways we orient ourselves that define how we relate to our roles in society.
And we have to understand the difference between these 3 terms, kimlik, kishilik, and kendelik. Let's start with kimlik. That's identity or role.
Kimlik, as the source defines it, is the set of societally constructed roles that are imposed on us. And crucially, they often override our individual choice. Think about the roles you're assigned at birth or by circumstance. Your nationality, your family role, even the fundamental identity of being a servant of God, kul olma.
It's the category society puts you in before you've even had a chance to say anything about it. It's the label on the box you're born into.
That's it. The function of kimlik is categorization. It gives you a whole list of required behaviors and expectations. The Jarek Leclerc. If you are a doctor, society has a fixed script for how you should behave. If you're a student, there's another script.
And the source points out a strange benefit to this restriction.
It's a paradox, yeah. Kimlik provides a strong sense of belonging, of aidiyat. It puts you in a comfortable, secure space with other people who share that label. You don't have to spend a lot of energy defining yourself because the requirements are already laid out for you. It's safe and predictable.
But the intellectual drawback is huge.
It's a radical reduction in dirigimi of the self.
Huh?
We are complex, multidimensional beings, but kimlik shoves us into a simplistic mold. And when we fulfill that script, society praises us. If we deviate, if the doctor starts acting like an artist, we're immediately judged as bad or unsuccessful in that role.
And the second stage, kishilik character or persona, is really just a reflection of how well we play that game.
That's all it is. Kishilik is defined by how well or how poorly you fulfill the requirements of your kimlik in society's eyes. It's your reputation, your public mask. It's still an external judgment, not an internal truth.
So the burning question then is, can we just escape kimlik? Can we just shed all these roles and become some kind of pure, label-free individual?
The source gives a very decisive no to that. It's impossible to fully avoid kimlik because we're interdependent beings. We're born into social structures. We rely on the teacher, the engineer, the farmer. We can't completely detach from these roles without, becoming a hermit.
Okay, so if we're stuck in the cage of imposed identity, how do we ever get to that final essential stage, kendelik, or authentic selfhood, shakhsiyat? How do we build a genuine character?
The path isn't avoidance, it's confrontation. To achieve kendelik, you need the existence of the non-self otiki, the other for definition. We need others and the roles they represent to show us the boundaries of our own roles so we can decide where we truly stand in relation to them.
So the goal is to sort of hijack the prefabricated identity and rebuild it into something unique and custom.
That is the perfect analogy. Since you can't avoid the identity, the kimlik, the path to authentic selfhood is to engage with those identities critically. This means using those 6 parameters of genuine thought we just talked about to scrutinize every single expectation attached to that role.
And what does that look like in practice? What does that scrutiny mean?
It means you have to actively understand the identity, interpret it through your own rational and ethical filters, select the parts that are meaningful, reject what's arbitrary or unjust, modify what's outdated, or even dismantle required behaviors that are inhuman. You take a label like motherhood and you ask, okay, Based on my core principles, what should motherhood truly be right here, right now?
So the thinking process itself, Sorgoladum, I sought justification, Yorumladum, I interpreted, Donusterdum, I transformed. That is the act of forming Kendelik.
Yes, the construction of your authentic self is the direct result of applying consistency and evidence to your pre-existing social roles. And this is why it's not ready-made, or Hazarbilanware. It's a continuous, relentless, never-ending journey of formation. The source calls it a bidimsiz bir olushum yokuluvu.
It's the constant work of customizing the operating system inside the prefab computer case of your identity. And if you stop that thinking process, you stop the coding, and you just revert to being a kishilik, defined only by what other people expect.
The thought process is the generator of an authentic life. It transforms the passive acceptance of a label into the active affirmation of a unique existence.
Okay, this relentless journey toward an authentic self, this Kendelik, it requires intellectual freedom, as Gurluk. And that freedom means confronting maybe the biggest restrictor of all, our relationship with the past, with tradition or Gelinek.
This section handles tradition with immense care. The source is very clear. Tradition is essential. It's the foundation we're standing on. To reject it completely would be like intellectual suicide. It would force us to try and build our entire worldview from scratch in a total vacuum.
So the goal isn't rejection, it's critique.
It's critique. Tradition has to be approached as raw material for critical review. We have to subject it to what's called the takikyantami, the method of verification. This is a process scholars use historically. You take all the previous views, you scrutinize them, you separate the verifiable truth from historical error, and then you build something new and verified on that secure foundation.
So we need to critique tradition to fulfill the amana of thought and secure our own creative freedom. So what are the obstacles in our normal passive view of tradition that block genuine thought? And what are the solutions?
We can look at these as 6 necessary corrections to prevent the past from suffocating the present. Obstacle 1, sanctified past understanding, or kutsanmush bir gesmish. The critique here is that we treat past reference points, say, a specific social structure or a scholar's interpretation, as if they're unchangeable, extra-historical truths. It's the belief that what was said or done in the 9th century applies universally and rigidly today.
That sounds like confusing the timeless principles of a tradition with the very specific historical application of those principles.
That's precisely it. When we give a trans-historical status, atarhistu bir huviet, to past human intellectual products, we create a rigid mold. If we treat a specific economic model from the 10th century as an untouchable dogma, we stifle any modern economic development because we're assuming they already found the final answer.
And the solution has to be dynamic, connecting past, present, and future.
It is. The solution is a realistic present and a visionary future. The past has to be treated as a hafuza, a memory that's rich with experience, not a rule book. We have to use Tzeker remembering the past to extract wisdom, to inform our tedabur, our planning, and precaution for the future. You can't have sound strategic planning if you ignore the memory of the past. Obstacle 2, created authority understanding. Uritilmishotorite. This one targets our tendency to see tradition as this inherently dominant, authoritative structure that just demands our submission. And when we do that, we ignore our own contemporary problems and needs.
This is the problem of who said it becoming more important than does it still work. It stops us from asking that critical question. Why did that original scholar hold that view? What context were they responding to back then?
Right. If we just submit to the authority without understanding the original context and justification they gave for that past ruling, we become useless at solving the problems of our own time. We have to scrutinize the why behind past ideas to see if it's still relevant today. The goal is to learn from their context, not blindly copy their conclusion.
So if a past idea no longer solves a current problem, we need the intellectual space to create a new solution, which aligns with the solution here. Creative freedom.
Creative freedom lets us engage with tradition as a massive resource pool, full of wisdom and justification, but not as a restrictive manual. If we can't explain why something was done, how can we possibly use it meaningfully today? Creative freedom allows the thinker to synthesize new solutions for current needs while still respecting the underlying ethics. Obstacle 3, vague subjectivity, or mufem aznoek. This one's a bit tricky. It's when we equate historical intellectual products from within the tradition with absolute final truth. This positions the past as the exclusive measure of correctness, the dozruluk ul susu.
So if the final truth was already achieved in the past, then any new contribution I make is immediately suspect or unnecessary or even just wrong.
Exactly. Yeah. It blocks all new intellectual and ethical contributions. It forces later generations to keep going back to square one instead of building on the foundation. If the past has the only measure of correctness, then all later generations are forced into subjectivity, because our present experience is always being measured against an unrepeatable historical moment.
And the source says this paradoxically blocks us from creating objective truth. The solution is principled objectivity. Olkasıl nisnelik.
Right. Genuine thought requires objective principles that are timeless, the rational, akli, and the ethical, halaki. If we let historical context be the only measure, we fall into this confusing subjectivity that, the source argues, blocks all development. We're called to find timeless truth, not just historical consensus. Obstacle 4, monopolistic methodology, tekelsilik. This is the belief that there's only one true method, one usual, or one perspective for understanding the world just because it was successful in the past.
This restricts our ability to see complexity. We're basically trying to fix every problem with only one tool from the toolbox.
If we only look at the world through a single political or philosophical or scientific lens, we only see one dimension of reality. The source argues that because humanity and life are multidimensional, understanding them requires multiple viewpoints and methodologies. If you try to analyze a social crisis using only economic data, you miss all the cultural and ethical complexity.
And the lesson from Abraham is key here. He used a second and third perspective, the moon, the stars, the sun, to understand his reality. So the solution has to be plurality, or şasulkuluk.
Yes, recognizing that no single method can capture all of reality. True rigor demands that we use every intellectual tool we have, rather than submitting to an intellectual authoritarianism that says, my way is the only way.
And we come back to obstacle 5, imitation or taklit, but now specifically in how we deal with tradition. Here it means the literal lofty reading of texts, clinging rigidly to the letter of the law instead of exploring the deeper intent, the mana or maksat.
If you stop at the surface level of a text, you inevitably fall into taklit. You're only asking, what did the text say? And you're completely neglecting the more profound question, what did it mean? What was it trying to achieve? If you don't seek the original justification, the gemreksa, for an idea, then you have no justification for applying it today.
The source's analogies for this are so striking. It says taklit is like a leash placed around the neck or a deadly poison.
That imagery is very intentional. It's a poison because it consumes your inner self. It prevents unique action and expression. Why bother trying to build an authentic self, a kindlik, if your only function is to perfectly replicate an ancient form? You're not just wasting your time. You are actively poisoning your own intellectual capacity.
And the solution then is to produce something that is both original and justified. Authenticated originality, takiki özgünlük.
This requires that deep dive into the intent, going beyond the surface reading. We have to understand the context, the rationale, the objective of the original thought. Only then, once we've authenticated that original spirit, can we translate it into something original and meaningful for our time and fulfill our responsibility. Finally, obstacle 6, stagnation, durasanlık. This is the belief that creation is complete, that nothing is developmental, that all knowledge and formation belongs to one specific time or person in the past. It's viewing existence as a finished product, oldu bidi.
A belief like that would stop all progress because it restricts the divine mandate for growth and completion.
The source sees this belief as completely antithetical to the nature of existence. Nothing in creation, not the universe, not the human being, it's given to us in a finished, perfected state. We are always in a process of development. If we believe creation is already complete, we're denying the necessary dynamism of existence.
So the solution has to be productive dynamism, or it can bear dynamism.
We have to honor that path toward completion, or kemo. Development tedrasilic, gradualness, and inshai, constructive formation is the fundamental mandate. We have to always be moving, always producing, always striving for better outcomes, and intellectual rigor is the tool that facilitates this ongoing formation.
Ultimately, all 6 of these solutions demand that we use that rigorous criteria-based thinking process from Section 3 to secure our freedom from the intellectual paralysis that comes from uncritically accepting the past. Hashtag outro. What a profound journey into the demands of what it means to genuinely think. We started by reframing thinking as the greatest trust, the amana, and our greatest responsibility, which set the stage for all ethical and rational accountability.
We then established those 6 non-negotiable architectural requirements for genuine thought: intentionality, criteria, stepwise progression, and that ultimate alignment with rational and ethical principles. That rigor is what's necessary to separate intellectual labor from just mental noise or reflex or that deadly imitation.
And we saw how that internal rigor is the only way to navigate the external world by critically engaging with our prefab social roles, our Kimlik, to begin that continuous, endless journey of building an authentic character, a Kendalik.
And finally, we learned that the same intellectual discipline has to be applied to tradition to achieve true creative freedom. We have to resist those 6 powerful obstacles that lead to intellectual stagnation and the poison of Toklit.
The source's final conclusion is so clear and powerful. Thinking is the greatest form of worship because it is the fundamental engine that builds Shasiyat. It's what moves us from a passive sleep state to an active, dynamic state of continuous becoming. It forces us to ask, am I just surviving and following the script, or am I striving to lead a meaningful, justified existence?
The first one requires no thought. The second one demands the maximum use of our cognitive potential to make sure our actions are consistent, coherent, and transformative.
So, if genuine thinking is defined by structure, by evidence, and by this dynamic process of becoming, here is our final provocative thought for you to chew on. Look at a significant, life-defining belief you hold right now. It could be a political conviction, a core ethical boundary, or your current professional path. How can you genuinely identify which parts of that belief are the result of imitation, of Toklit things you accepted purely based on the authority of your environment, your family, or your history, and which parts are the result of authenticated originality, of Takiki Özgünlük? Meaning, have you actually subjected that belief to all 6 criteria of intentionality, evidence, consistency, and alignment, making it truly rigorously your own? Think about that until the next time we take the deep dive.
Thank you for joining us.
Welcome back to The Critique.
Great to be here.
Today we're diving into a really profound manuscript. It argues that genuine, rigorous thinking, so way beyond just emotional reaction or memorizing things, is the absolute foundation for human accountability and for building a self-aware character.
This material is, it's exceptionally rich. It draws these really powerful creative parallels between theological ideas like spiritual trust or eminent, and the philosophical journey of building an authentic self.
The foundation is rock solid.
Absolutely robust. So our focus today is purely on, let's say, polishing the internal structure. We want to maximize the impact of these incredibly valuable, highly actionable concepts. It's all about clarity and momentum.
Okay, so let's start with that first section. I can see what you were going for. You meticulously establish that real thought isn't just spontaneous. It requires serious concentration, clear criteria, definite stages.
Right. It's a structured, serious activity.
It is. But structurally, there's a moment of, well, it's almost intellectual whiplash for the reader.
Uh-huh.
We move very, very quickly from the mechanical rules of thought, the how we think, to this enormous existential destination of selfhood, the who we are.
And the bridge isn't quite there.
It isn't. And that quick pivot, it risks losing readers who don't immediately connect the dots between logic and existence. You define sound thought so well, but then it's an abrupt jump to the 3 stages of identity: societal, personality, and authentic selfhood.
We need to spell out why. Why are the rules of logic and rigor so tied to building character?
Exactly. So to maintain that reader momentum and clarity, that transition from defining the mechanical requirements of thinking to the complex anthropological discussion of character building, it just needs an explicit conceptual bridge.
The weakness is that it moves too fast from the requirements of thought to the results of thought.
I think the solution is actually already in the text, you know?
Oh, yeah?
You introduce this powerful concept of human accountability, being responsible, mukallaf, and this profound idea of trust as the reason we have this capacity to think.
That's the stake.
That is the stake. That has to be the link we use.
Precisely. So we leverage the material's own concept of accountability as the main connective tissue. If thinking is the basis for that high accountability, then all that intellectual rigor, the consistency, the proof, the seriousness, that's the cost of fulfilling that immense spiritual trust.
It elevates the whole argument, doesn't it? It goes beyond just philosophy and into the realm of, destiny.
It does. So I think we need to make that connection highly explicit right after defining the criteria for thought. After discussing how thought needs consistency and proof, you insert a brief, focused statement.
Linking the rigor directly to the elevation of the human being through this trust.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be a passive transition. It should feel like a declaration of what's at stake.
And to make it even sharper, you could use that distinction the material already makes. Thinking is required not just for survival, but for making life meaningful. Use that distinction to directly set up the next major theme. It would clarify why passively accepting a societal identity is just not enough for a being that's been entrusted with such a high responsibility.
Right. It forces the reader to understand immediately that abandoning rigorous thought means abandoning the core meaning and highest duty of being human.
And that connection builds the perfect tension for the identity section that follows.
Okay, let's move on. That second major section, the discussion on the 6 intellectual barriers to genuine thought.
The analysis here is fantastic. It covers everything from the sanctified past to accepting, produced authority. It's intellectually just so profound.
The insight into stagnation and the risk of ambiguity over principled objectivity is undeniable. I particularly admire the analogy of imitation, or taqlid, as a collar or a leash and a deadly poison.
That language is so vivid, so powerful.
It is, but I do worry a little about the scale of the application here. The material makes a strong case, but the critique of these inhibitors is aimed mostly at, high-stakes historical and theological texts.
Right. And the listener, our listener, is focused on improving their own daily thinking and their written work, not just critiquing ancient traditions.
They need specific, actionable guidance on how these 6 flaws creep into ordinary, even low-stakes judgment, how they dilute the very power of thinking, which the material itself calls the greatest worship.
The issue is that the abstract framing, it risks reducing the urgency of the critique for the everyday person. If these barriers only exist in some big scholarly context, the reader might feel, safe.
Yeah, they'll think, oh, that's not me.
We have to show that these scholarly failings happen every single time they evaluate a political claim, or read a project proposal, or even write an email.
So the core issue is that these profoundly insightful intellectual barriers, they need to be aggressively grounded in immediate, low-stakes scenarios to show how relevant they are to daily life.
That's how we activate the critique. Make it urgent.
So the suggestion is really to extend the concrete application beyond religious texts or scholarly history and apply the exact same principles to daily critical analysis.
That would prove the universality of the barriers and really raise the personal stakes.
Let's give some specific examples. You could take the difference between, say, literal reading and seeking meaning and intent.
Okay.
Suggest applying that critical lens not just to faith text, but to interpreting any foundational document someone might critique, like a corporate policy, a detailed proposal, or a statement of organizational goals.
Oh, that's brilliant. It forces the listener to realize that passive literalism is an intellectual failure, no matter what the document is.
Right. They have to ask, am I just reading the words on the page, or am I doing the hard work of seeking the deeper intent?
And what about that powerful analogy of imitation as a deadly poison?
For that one, we should challenge the listener to locate the produced authorities in their own non-theological areas.
So, what are the unquestioned norms in their professional field?
Exactly. Which dominant opinions in their social group or their industry have they just accepted because some authority produced them?
That's a huge ask. We're asking them to challenge the very foundation of their professional identity, which is a scary and difficult thing to do.
It is, but isn't that the definition of authentic selfhood in action?
It is.
They should then apply the rigorous verification method, that systematic approach used by thinkers like Faridin Razi to analyze and dismantle existing opinions, and apply it directly to these contemporary, low-stakes authorities.
It immediately elevates their daily critical thinking into a scholarly method of verification.
And makes the abstract concept urgently practical.
Okay, moving on to the third key area, the relationship between societal identity and authentic selfhood. The material is just masterful in introducing this paradox.
The paradox that societal identity, being a parent, a migrant, a professional, is unavoidable, but that you have to actively engage with it. You have to question it, demolish it, complete it.
To achieve authentic selfhood.
It's a wonderful concept, but the process of transformation feels a little incomplete. The listener is told they need to question or transform an identity, but they don't have the explicit, text-supported criteria, the why for selection or rejection.
It feels a bit ambiguous.
It does. And the risk there is that this transformation of identity could seem arbitrary, or, based purely on subjective feelings rather than on intellectual rigor.
So the material introduces this paradox: a societal identity is necessary for developing authentic selfhood, but the process of choosing, transforming, or demolishing that identity needs clearer, text-supported criteria to avoid that subjectivity.
And this is where we can unify the entire intellectual system you've built.
How so?
The suggestion is to explicitly integrate the 4 criteria for sound thought, which were established way back in the definition section, into the identity transformation process itself. They can't exist as separate ideas.
Oh, I see. So those 4 core principles, rational principles, moral principles, faith principles, and above all, consistency, those become the listener's filter for navigating identity?
Exactly. If those criteria govern the process of sound thought, they must also govern the construction of the self that results from that thought.
This is probably the highest form of actionable feedback we can give. We're offering the listener a checklist for testing their own roles.
Right. They can apply these 4 internal filters whenever they encounter an expectation tied to a societal identity. So, for instance, they should ask themselves, does requirement X, which is associated with my identity as Y, lack consistency with the rational principles I established earlier?
That totally clarifies the decision-making. If a societal expectation fails that internal test, the listener now has an intellectual justification for transforming or demolishing that specific part of their identity.
It's no longer subjective. It becomes a matter of intellectual rigor.
And to really emphasize the cognitive effort required here, we should also highlight the importance of the material's recognition of the 6 different dimensions of thought. Things like contemplation, reflection, and consideration.
Good point. Transforming a societal identity isn't a quick decision. It requires that kind of multidimensional cognitive effort.
Yeah, it needs deep, reflective analysis to assess the past damage or benefit of that identity, combined with a forward-looking plan to define future actions outside of its restrictive confines.
It requires every single tool in the intellectual shed you've provided.
You've given the listener the tools, now you just have to explicitly tell them to use those tools to dismantle their own reality.
This has been a deeply rewarding critique of some truly high-level work.
Yeah, we focused entirely on maximizing the structural clarity and the overall impact of your core ideas.
The 3 central actions we'd encourage you to implement are, first, solidify the structure. Use accountability and spiritual trust as that explicit conceptual link.
To ensure a smooth transition from the mechanics of thought to the development of selfhood.
Second, don't let your brilliant critique of intellectual barriers live only in history. Activate it. Apply the 6 flaws immediately to the low-stakes, daily decisions your audience is making,
Proving the urgent universality of your argument.
And finally, unify your intellectual system. Deploy those 4 defined criteria for sound thinking: rationality, morality, faith, and consistency as the explicit, non-subjective filter for navigating and transforming societal identity into authentic selfhood.
That central insight that true thought is the highest form of worship because it fosters a responsible, self-aware character is just a tremendously powerful concept.
It really is.
We look forward to seeing the increased power and impact of this piece when you submit it back to the critique.
Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are diving deep into an intellectual tradition that places the act of dushinmek, that is, critical conscious thought, not merely as, a beneficial habit, but really at the absolute core of human purpose. The source material we're looking at makes this extraordinarily powerful claim that critical, self-directed thought is truly the greatest and most important act of worship, or ibadat.
And that is the crucial interpretive hinge for our discussion today. The core question is whether thinking holds that supreme status as the paramount spiritual act, the en-buk ibadet, or if its defining and essential function is instead foundational. I'm going to argue that thinking serves as the non-negotiable prerequisite, the necessary basis for moral accountability, or mukellafiyet, which in turn determines the ethical quality of all our other actions.
And I'll be standing firmly on the side that asserts thinking is the paramount act of worship. It's the very engine of all spiritual advancement.
And I come at it from a different way. I'll argue for thinking as the foundational necessity that establishes the entire framework for human responsibility and ultimately for authentic character development.
So my core position is really rooted in this belief that thinking, deshunmek, it has to be understood as the greatest and most important act of worship. And precisely because it is the fundamental determinant of klite, the intentional quality of every other spiritual and moral activity we undertake. I mean, think about it. If the foundational understanding, the altiapas, for any other devotional act, whether it's prayer, namaz, or pilgrimage, hajj, if that's not rigorously established through self-directed thought, then the action itself becomes routine. It becomes automated, or, merely performative. It loses the intentionality that's required to achieve its objective. The text is very clear that the goal of these acts is to move the individual away from fundamental error and misjudgment. So if the thought isn't primary, the action is hollow, and the mind just remains vulnerable to being frozen by simply accepting others' judgments as mere taklit, as imitation. A conscious effort of deshunmek is what makes any spiritual acts authentic.
I certainly agree that thought is the prerequisite for quality. I don't think anyone would dispute that. But I believe the text frames its definitive function differently. I see it as establishing our unique human capacity for responsibility, for sodom look, and thus our moral accountability, our mukelefiyet. It's the vital prerequisite that makes the rest of the spiritual structure possible. The analysis is very specific. It distinguishes human thought from simple animal comprehension, or idrak, exactly because human thought establishes this tight connection, this irtibat, with accountability. This profound responsibility is described as an imanet, a divine trust, a deposit, which shows that humanity is elevated and entrusted with this rational capacity. So, in this reading, thinking serves as the element ikbasama, the first step of action. Its utility is in initiating a practical enactment. The ultimate measure, therefore, is ilam practice, which has to be built upon the sound foundation that thought provides. Without that bedrock of rational accountability, the whole structure it collapses.
That's a compelling argument for the necessity of thought. I'll grant you that. But I would argue that necessity and supremacy are not mutually exclusive here. If thinking were merely a prerequisite, then why would the material emphasize the absolute centrality of this act by stating that God only trusts the thinking servant? Trust is reserved for the essential bearer of the imanet. I see why you think trust confirms it's a foundation, but let me offer you a different perspective. The quality of ibadat it's not a chance outcome. It is a direct product of that kisitle, that intentional, and binachli, that conscious effort. This sustained, deliberate engagement is what elevates the act beyond being just a functional tool. It makes it the most significant form of devotion because it requires the continuous active use of our highest human faculty.
I see why you elevate the concept of intentionality. I really do. But I just don't buy that it necessitates labeling it the greatest ibadat. Defining it that way, it risks intellectualizing spirituality. It creates a hierarchy where internal contemplation supersedes practical piety, which the material constantly links to ethical conduct in the world. That emphasis on trust, it absolutely confirms that thinking is the prerequisite for ethical success, the ability to bear the trust. But doesn't it shift our focus away from the how? When we look at the specific language the source uses, we see complexity, not singularity. The text employs multiple verbs for thought, such as tefekkur, ta'akol, tazekur, tadeber.
That's an interesting point about the multiple dimensions of thought, but how does it actually diminish the primacy of the shinmek as a whole?
Well, it diminishes the concept of a single supreme act. These multiple verbs, they indicate layered dimensions of thought, not one singular isolated contemplation that supersedes all others. I mean, if we define these terms, we see they are inherently tied to action and consequence. Tafakkur is deep, reflective contemplation. Ta'akul is reasoned understanding and application. But then we have tazekkur, which is focused on memory, on drawing lessons from the past, and actively reflecting on consequences. And perhaps most importantly, tadabbur. That's proactive thinking, planning for the future, taking necessary measures, and shaping tomorrow's actions. These dynamic mechanisms, they initiate and guide practice. They are processes that serve the moral and active life. So they function as the essential mechanism of mukallafiyat, not the supreme end in itself.
I'm not convinced that framing thought as the essential mechanism really captures its revolutionary nature. The text is clear that the path to moral failure is intellectual stagnation. If we accept your premise that the ultimate measure is ilm, or practice, how do we guarantee that that practice is meaningful and not just conditioned behavior? Thought is the constant self-correction mechanism. It's the guardrail against error.
And that's the hinge, isn't it? The difference between a foundational requirement and a supreme act. Let's pivot to the structures that guide that thought. I think you place too much singular emphasis on intellectual critique, which risks jettisoning essential structures. The material identifies 6 specific barriers to thought, and while it rightly critiques the blind acceptance of the past, it also emphasizes the danger of rejecting gelenek, or tradition, wholesale. Tradition serves as our hafiza, a collective memory of countless past intellectual and spiritual efforts. If we reject it entirely, the text suggests we fall into a void. Bush lua ducheres. Thinking must be vigorous, of course, but we have to acknowledge that gelenek provides the necessary starting point, the raw, shared material for our reflective process.
I see why you emphasize tradition as memory, but I would frame the issue a bit differently. I'm not convinced that line of reasoning fully addresses the danger posed by taqlid. The central issue is not gelenek itself, but the manner in which it is approached. The necessity is the critical method, tahqiq, or critical verification. We have to apply the rigorous methodology that was used by great scholars, someone like Fakhruddin Razi, who took all extant views and critically distinguished the true from the false. Accepting traditional judgments without this conscious, intentional critique is what turns necessary structures into the deadly poison, Oldrucu bir zehirdir, of taqlid.
But doesn't tahqiq itself rely on a foundation of established tradition? I mean, you can't verify something without knowing what came before.
Well, yes, of course, but the goal of tahqiq is precisely to move beyond the notion that past knowledge, however authoritative it may seem, is the nihai hakihat, the final settled truth for all time. Thought has to be continually reapplying truth to the contemporary context. When we fail to do this, when we engage in thoughtless action, we fall into those errors that the text warns us against, the facha and munkar. These terms, they refer to immoral and repellent actions that result from internal confusion and misjudgment. So critical thought is the only prophylactic against those deep behavioral errors. Therefore, the act that saves us from the poison of taqlid and the pitfalls of fahsha and munkar must be, by definition, the supreme act.
I understand the gravity of avoiding taqlid, but the necessity of thought as a tool for avoiding error doesn't automatically make it the greatest worship. It makes it the best survival mechanism. Let's be rigorous about the foundation. If thinking is the means by which we are held accountable, our mukallafiyat, then the framework of ethical action, which relies on the stability of gelenek as a memory structure, must be equally crucial. Without that stable memory, the critical mind has no common language or history to critique. The critical thinking process is essential, yes, but its purpose is to refine the foundation of moral action, which is the bearing of the eminent.
And that distinction you're making between mechanism and supremacy, it leads directly to the ultimate purpose of thinking within the source material, achieving kindelik, selfhood, or character. The text describes this pursuit as a continuous bitimsiz birwalashum yolculuğu, an endless journey of formation, and that journey is exclusively driven by critical thought. It requires actively engaging with, challenging, and transforming the external imposed kimligler, the ready-made limiting categories society defines for us, like being a parent or an expert or a refugee, göçmen. Thinking enables one to choose, reject, or transform these categories, thereby earning one's shakhsiyet, one's authentic character. If thought were merely a mechanism for accountability, this revolutionary self-formation would be impossible.
That's a powerful statement about earned character. And I absolutely agree the goal is Kendalic. But have you considered the inherent paradox presented in the analysis of Kimlik? Kimlik is indeed described as limiting, classifying, restrictive. We are put in boxes. Yet the material insists it is impossible to be entirely free, azare olmak mumkin değil, from these society structures. We are inherently relational and contextual beings.
Exactly. And because we cannot be entirely free, the effort of thought must be supreme, constantly working to break the chains of imposition.
I would say not to break the chains, but to interpret them. The Kendalic formation isn't about some intellectual rejection of the structure. It's about interpretation and transformation within the structure. Kindlik provides the necessary friction and context, the structure we are muhtaj, that we are in need of. Without that fixed external definition, the dynamic Kendalic has nothing to push against. Thinking's function here is primarily interpretive and transformational, making it an essential, high-level mechanism for navigating the inescapable paradox of existence, rather than a spiritual act that supersedes the entire moral framework it supports. Thought is the skill used to live rightly, but living rightly, bearing the eminent, that is the ultimate end.
I still maintain that the interpretive skill that leads to selfhood is the highest expression of our potential. If thought is the key to earning your shakhsiyat, the quality that defines you as a full human, then no other activity can be considered more important. Düşünmek is the primary responsibility because it dictates the quality and authenticity of one's entire life path. It is the engine that ensures constant self-formation, or kendalik, and provides the essential protection from intellectual stagnation, or duranluk, which the material basically equates to the death of a purposeful existence.
You know, what this discussion really illuminates is the profound depth of the source material. Whether we frame thought as the greatest worship or as the essential foundation for accountability, the complex relationship between intellectual effort, spiritual quality, and moral duty demonstrates that the analysis provides profound avenues for deeper exploration. Absolutely, particularly when we examine those specific multiple dimensions of thought. Tefekkur, which is reflection, tezekur, remembering lessons, and tedebur, active planning, and their precise requirements for developing a truly conscious, active, and fully realized human life.